Lecture 10, A Cognitive View of Learning. Last time, we examined some aspects of classical conditioning with a view towards their implications for the traditional stimulus-response theories of learning. And what we learned was that cognitive processes are critical to even such elementary forms of learning as classical conditioning. Conditioning occurs only when the unconditioned stimulus surprises the organism, when it's not something the organism expects to occur. And conditioning occurs only when there's some other event in the environment, the conditioned stimulus, that provides information about the unconditioned stimulus, that signals whether and when the unconditioned stimulus is going to occur. What this means is that in classical conditioning, the organism is learning to predict environmental events. The organism develops expectations about what's going to happen when certain events occur in the environment. Now we learned all that from studies of classical conditioning. What about instrumental conditioning? Where does cognition fit in there? To review for a second, let's look at the two-factor theory of avoidance learning discussed in the last lecture as proposed by Maurer in the late 1940s. Maurer argued that there were two different things that occurred during avoidance learning. First, by virtue of classical conditioning, fear was conditioned to the tone conditioned stimulus. And second, by virtue of instrumental conditioning, either escape responses were reinforced by the offset of the shock, or avoidance responses were reinforced by the offset of the tone to which the fear had been conditioned. One of the predictions that Maurer's two-factor theory made was that avoidance learning would be facilitated if the organism has already undergone fear conditioning. The idea is that the organism has already acquired a fear response to the conditioned stimulus. And so now all it has to do is to learn to avoid the unconditioned stimulus. And this avoidance response itself is reinforced by the reduction of fear that comes when the tone goes off. This prediction was tested by Martin Seligman and his colleagues Stephen Mayer and Bruce Overmyer in a series of experiments on what has come to be called learned helplessness. The prediction was that prior fear conditioning should facilitate avoidance learning because the organism has already learned to fear the conditioned stimulus and only has to learn an avoidance response. In phase 1 of a helplessness experiment, an animal receives classical fear conditioning trials in which a tone-conditioned stimulus is paired with a foot shock unconditioned stimulus until the animal reliably shows a conditioned fear response to the tone. In phase 2 of the experiment, the same animal is placed in a shuttle box of the usual sort for avoidance training. The tone comes on, the same tone that the animal was conditioned to before, followed by a foot shock delivered to the floor of one section. In standard avoidance learning experiments, without phase 1, animals learn the avoidance response readily and shuttle back and forth reliably from one section of the box to the other as the tones come on. However, Seligman and his colleagues discovered that in this new situation, with phase 1 inserted before phase 2, avoidance learning was actually retarded. Animals who had already been conditioned to fear the tone were slower to acquire the avoidance response when placed in the shuttle box. Here are the details of their very first experiment by Seligman and Mayer. Again, all the animals received avoidance training in the shuttle box situation. But before being placed in the shuttle box, they were given a pretreatment of 64 signaled shocks. That is, 64 shocks that were each preceded by a tone-conditioned stimulus. Some of the animals were actually able to escape the shock by pressing a paddle with their snouts. Other animals, known as yoked controls, received exactly the same amount of shock as the escape group, but they had no ability to escape. There was nothing they could do to turn the shock off or prevent it from coming on. This is pretty much a standard classical conditioning group where the tone is followed by shock, tone, shock, tone, shock. And then there was a standard control group which received no shocks, no tones, nothing at all. And here are the results of that experiment. Almost 75% of the animals in the yoked control group failed to make any escape responses at all. And when they did successfully escape, it took them much longer on average to make that escape response. So what's going on here? Seligman and his associates reasoned that learned helplessness reflects the acquisition of negative expectations of control. In classical fear conditioning, the shock is both inescapable and unavoidable. The animal learns to predict the shock, that it's going to come on after the tone. But also remember that in classical conditioning, reinforcement occurs regardless of the animal's response. So, in this case, the shock is both inescapable and unavoidable. Tone is followed by shock. Tone is followed by shock, and there's just nothing the animal can do about it. Accordingly, in such a situation, the animal acquires a negative expectation, an expectation that nothing can be done about the occurrence of the shock. And it's this negative expectation, acquired in the classical conditioning experiment, which generalizes to the avoidance learning situation. So whereas in classical conditioning, the organism is learning to predict its environment, in instrumental conditioning, the organism is learning to control its environment. Through instrumental conditioning, the organism is developing a set of expectations about what it can control and how and what it can't. The moral of all this is that in a very important sense, conditioning is the wrong metaphor for learning. In fact, a better metaphor might be computing. The learning organism is trying to figure things out, and it does this, in a sense, by computing conditional probabilities. In classical conditioning, the organism is learning to predict its world. It identifies signals that are valid predictors of important events. It computes which events, conditioned stimuli, predict other events, unconditioned stimuli. In instrumental conditioning, the organism is learning to control its world by computing which actions, conditioned responses, lead to desirable changes in the environment, reinforcements, or, for that matter, undesirable changes in the environment. Prediction and control, signals and information. That's what learning is all about in classical and instrumental conditioning. A similar point is made by studies on the role of reinforcement in learning. Recall that the conventional view expressed in the stimulus-response theory of learning and Thorndike's law of effect is that nothing is learned in the absence of reinforcement, that reinforcement stamps in or conditions an association between stimuli and responses. This means that in classical conditioning, the conditioned stimulus must be followed by a reinforcing unconditioned stimulus. And in instrumental conditioning, the conditioned response must be followed by reward or punishment. In Skinner's version of Thorndike's law of effect, reinforcement is any event that increases the likelihood that the animal will make a conditioned response in the presence of the conditioned stimulus. Still, reinforcement is necessary for the stimulus-response association to occur in the first place. However, a number of experiments make it clear that reinforcement is not by any means necessary for learning to occur. Consider, for example, two of the advanced phenomena of classical conditioning. In sensory preconditioning, the CS1 elicits a conditioned response even though it's never been paired with the unconditioned stimulus. The CS1 elicits a conditioned response just because it's been paired with the CS2, which has been paired with the unconditioned stimulus. But the animal has learned to associate the CS1 with the CS2, even though that particular association has never been reinforced. What the animals learned is not just that the CS2 predicts the unconditioned stimulus, but that the CS1 predicts the unconditioned stimulus as well by transitivity. The CS2 predicts the US, CS1 predicts CS2. Therefore, by transitivity, CS1 predicts the US. Something similar occurs in higher order conditioning, where CS2 elicits a conditioned response even though it's never been paired with the unconditioned stimulus. In higher order conditioning, the animal has learned that CS1 predicts the US, and later learns that the CS2 predicts CS1. Therefore, again, by transitivity, the CS2 will come to predict the US as well. In both instances, the animal has learned to respond to a stimulus even though its response to that stimulus has never been reinforced. These results are difficult to explain by a theory that assumes that reinforcement is necessary for learning to occur, but they're easy to explain as an extension of the principle of association by contingency. Animals in conditioning experiments are learning the predictive relationships among events in their environment. If there's an event out there that signals another event, that in turn signals the unconditioned stimulus, the animal is going to learn the contingent association between those two signals. The same point was made with respect to instrumental conditioning in famous studies of latent learning performed by Edward C. Tolman, after whom the Education and Psychology building at Berkeley is named. Tolman's experiments involved a maze learning procedure in which hungry rats were placed in the start box of a maze, and food was placed in the goal box. Over trials, the rats would learn through trial and error how to make their way through the maze. According to traditional stimulus response theory, these responses, first turn left, then turn right, then go straight, then turn left, whatever, these responses were reinforced by the delivery of food in the goal box. Now, intuitively, from the point of view of SR theory, this makes sense. But Tolman asked whether the reinforcement was really necessary for learning to occur, and he quickly found that it was not. In one classic experiment by Tolman and Hanzik, there were 3 groups of rats. Group 1 was rewarded on every trial with food in the goal box. This is, of course, a standard instrumental conditioning procedure. It's no different from the sort of thing that Thorndike or Skinner would have done. As expected, this group showed a gradual reduction in errors. They took less and less time over the successive trials to make their way from the start box to the goal box where they were fed. Group 2 received no reward on any trial, and as you can see, they barely showed any change in their response latency. They took a relatively long time to make their way from the start box to the goal box on every trial. They didn't seem to be learning anything. And of course, this would also be consistent with our standard SR theory, because these animals weren't reinforced. There was no food in the goal box, so there's no reason to expect them to learn anything at all. The critical group, the third group, got no reward for the first 10 trials, but then reward was introduced on trial 11, again after 10 trials without any reward. For the first 10 trials of the experiment, these animals behaved just like their counterparts in the control group, which never got any reward, because that's what they were. However, on trial 11, they showed an immediate reduction in errors, and subsequently they behaved similarly to group 1, which had been rewarded all along. Tolman concluded that the animals in this last group learned how to get from the start box to the goal box across the first 10 trials, but just needed a reason to do it, and a reason to do it fast. This reason was provided on trial 11 and on the subsequent reinforced trials. In other words, Tolman's animals learned their way around the maze, including the way from the start box to the goal box, without any reinforcement at all. Over those first 10 trials of exploration, they developed a kind of mental map of their environment. This map, acquired in the absence of reinforcement, was then available for them to use for a variety of purposes. And when, on trial 11, they first found food in the goal box, they said to themselves something like, "Oh, food! I know how to get here." So afterwards they ran like the rats in the first group that were rewarded all the time. But they didn't perform any goal-directed response until the introduction of reinforcement established that goal. Put another way, reinforcement controls performance rather than learning. Animals learn in the absence of reinforcement just by virtue of having certain learning experiences. But reinforcement isn't necessary for this process. Rather, reinforcement controls performance. Reinforcement determines whether the animal is going to act on what it's learned in the absence of reinforcement. A similar point was made in research on infant rhesus monkeys published in the early 1950s by Harry Harlow, a name you may recognize from his famous studies of monkey love and motherless monkeys. In one set of studies, Harlow presented his monkeys with a wooden puzzle box consisting of a series of latches which, when moved in the right order, would open a door. As in Tolman's experiments, some animals were rewarded with food when they opened the door. Others received no reward at all. And in this case, somewhat surprisingly, what Harlow observed was absolutely no difference in the monkeys' problem-solving behavior. Monkeys who were not rewarded solved the puzzle, opened the door, just as quickly, just as readily as those that were rewarded. In fact, if the animals were hungry, hunger appeared to interfere with solving the puzzle. If they were not hungry, but were rewarded with food anyway, they didn't consume the reward, but usually stored it in some place for later consumption. Like Tolman, Harlow concluded that reinforcement wasn't doing anything in the learning process. Rather, Harlow concluded that the monkeys were simply curious about the puzzle. In Harlow's view, this behavior, curiosity, is a kind of intrinsic motivation. It reflects the desire to perform some activity, like opening a puzzle lock, without any promise or prospect of reward. This isn't to say that animals aren't also motivated by extrinsic considerations such as hunger and thirst, only that these are not the only possible rewards. Considering only extrinsic motivations, such as hunger, Harlow's monkeys learned whether they were rewarded or not. So even in the absence of reinforcement, learning appears to occur naturally in most behaving organisms, at least mammalian species like infant monkeys and rats. Through experience, organisms acquire information about events in their environment and about the outcomes of their behaviors. Reinforcement doesn't cause this learning to occur. The learning occurs whether reinforcement is present or not. Rather, reinforcement merely motivates the organism to act on what it's learned anyway, in order to achieve certain outcomes and avoid others. So this is the final blow to the traditional stimulus-response theory of learning, that what's learned in learning is not the association between some stimulus and some response. Rather, what's acquired in learning are expectations concerning the outcomes of events, as in classical conditioning, where the organism learns to predict one environmental event from another environmental event, and expectations about the outcomes of behaviors, as in instrumental conditioning, where the animal learns to control environmental events. The idea that organisms don't simply learn the associations between stimuli and responses, but rather are learning how to predict and control their world, leads us to offer a cognitive reinterpretation of learning. Instead of defining learning as a relatively permanent change in behavior that results from experience, what's really going on here is that during learning, there's a relatively permanent change in the organism's knowledge resulting from experience, knowledge that it can then use in the service of adaptive behavior. Usually we think of learning as resulting from the direct experience of environmental events, organismal behaviors, and their outcomes. In classical conditioning, Pavlov's dog gets food after hearing a bell. In instrumental conditioning, Thorndike's cats get freedom after pressing the latch, and Skinner's pigeons get a food pellet after pecking a key. In each of these cases, the animal itself has had some experience of both the events and their consequences. But it turns out that animals can also learn from observing other animals. They don't have to have the experiences themselves. They can learn vicariously from the behavior and experiences of other creatures. Observational learning by animals was first demonstrated convincingly in the laboratory by Susan Meinecke, using a paradigm called observational fear conditioning. Meinecke was mostly interested in the phenomenon of snake fear in rhesus monkeys and other primates. Rhesus monkeys, born and raised in the wild, are universally afraid of snakes. And, as you might imagine, this is something that's quite adaptive. After all, the monkeys are living in an environment where there are lots of deadly snakes, vipers as well as constrictors. And the traditional view of this was that fear of snakes in these monkeys was innate, programmed by evolution in the same way that various kinds of instincts are. The only problem with the theory, as Meinecke observed, is that monkeys who were born and raised in laboratory conditions aren't afraid of snakes. When exposed to a snake, they show no signs of fear. So fear of snakes isn't something that's innate in monkeys. It has to be, apparently, acquired through experience. But if you think about it, it's not entirely clear how you can learn from experience to fear a deadly snake. Because, after the first encounter, you're likely to be dead. Therefore, Meinecke proposed that monkeys actually acquire their fear of snakes vicariously, from observing the reactions of other monkeys when they encounter snakes. Thus, snake fear is not innate. It's learned, but it's not exactly learned by direct experience. It's learned vicariously from observing the behaviors, the reactions of other animals. Meinecke then proceeded to conduct an ingenious series of experiments to investigate this hypothesis of the social learning of snake fear in rhesus monkeys. For her experiment, she employed a piece of equipment known as the Wisconsin General Test Apparatus, because it was devised by Harry Harlow, the same Harry Harlow we discussed earlier, at the University of Wisconsin. In the WGTA, the monkey is seated in a restraining chair, something like a baby's high chair, while being presented with various stimuli and making responses to them. Here, you see a monkey being offered a choice between two objects. In her experiments, Meinecke offered the monkeys a highly desirable treat. I think it was Fruit Loops, actually. But in order to obtain the treat, it had to reach past a snake or some other object. Response latency, or the time it took the animal to reach past the object, was the measure of fear. The longer the latency, the longer it took the monkey to reach past the object, the more fear there was. Meinecke's initial study compared monkeys reared in the wild and those that were reared in the lab on their responses to various test stimuli such as a real snake, a toy snake, a model snake, black and yellow power cords, and a painted wood block. The real snake, by the way, was a small boa constrictor. As you can see, the animals who were reared in the wild were much more afraid of the snake than were the animals that were raised in the lab. They took much longer to reach past the snake to get the desired food. And this fear generalized to the toy snake and the model snake as well. By contrast, neither wild-reared monkeys nor lab-reared monkeys showed any fear to the power cords or to the painted wooden block. So the wild-reared adult monkeys avoided the snakes, but lab-reared adolescents were simply indifferent to them. At this point, Meinecke began the observational fear conditioning procedure. A lab-reared adolescent was allowed to observe for the very first time the reaction of a wild-reared adult to a snake presented in the Wisconsin General Test Apparatus. Remember that on the pretest, the wild-reared adults showed that they were already afraid of snakes, whereas their lab-reared adolescent offspring had no snake fear at all, and, in fact, had never seen a snake before. Here are the results from the pretest prior to the vicarious exposure. And as you can see, the parents are very much afraid of the snake, but the offspring are indifferent to it. They're not behaving with respect to the real snake or the toy or the model snake any differently than they do to the neutral object, the painted wooden block. Remember, in this experiment, time spent in the presence of the object is the measure of fear. The parents are obviously avoiding the real snake, the toy snake and the model snake, preferring to reach over the neutral painted block, whereas the offspring, the adolescent lab-reared animals, don't care what they have to reach over. But things are quite different after the adolescents have been exposed to the adult behaving fearfully in the presence of the snake. Both the wild-reared parents and their lab-reared offspring are now avoiding the snake-like objects, the real snake, the toy snake, and the model snake, and spending all of their time with the neutral object, the painted wooden block. These lab-reared adolescents have learned to fear and avoid the snake and snake-like objects just by watching their parents react fearfully to those objects. In other words, these adolescent monkeys, reared in the lab and not naturally afraid of snakes at all, learn to fear snakes, not from having unpleasant experiences with the snakes themselves, but merely from watching an adult react negatively to them. They learn from observing other monkeys behaving fearfully that snakes are things to be feared. Meinecke subsequently performed a number of variants on this basic experiment with increasingly sophisticated methods to explore various aspects of this observational fear conditioning. In the first experiment I described, the model was the adolescent monkey's own parent, but she could also get vicarious learning when an unrelated adult served as the model for the adolescent. She also discovered that prior benign experience with snakes could actually immunize adolescents against the effects of later exposure to a fearful model. Cleverly employing mirrors and later a video setup, Meinecke arranged for an adult model to see a snake and react fearfully to it, while the adolescent saw a flower rather than a snake. From the adolescent's point of view, then, the adult is reacting fearfully to the flower, but not to a snake. The adolescent, in fact, doesn't know anything about a snake. The question is, will an adolescent who sees such a thing, an adult apparently responding fearfully to a flower, subsequently develop a vicariously conditioned fear of flowers? The answer is no. When an adolescent monkey observes an adult monkey behave fearfully in the presence of a flower, it doesn't acquire any fear of the flower. It reaches past the flower for food just as quickly after exposure as before. So vicarious exposure of snake fear occurs very quickly, but vicarious learning of flower fear doesn't appear to occur at all. Snake fear in rhesus monkeys isn't innate, but it does appear to be highly prepared so that it can be acquired with very little vicarious experience. Apparently, evolution hasn't built in a fear of snakes, but what it's built into the monkeys is a disposition to become fearful of snakes under the right circumstances. Outside the laboratory, observational learning has been very frequently observed by researchers working in the field, looking at animals behaving in their natural environment. So, for example, it's been shown that chickadees who watch another chickadee open a milk bottle will learn quickly to open the milk bottle themselves. Observational learning produces a kind of savings in learning how to open a milk bottle. And red squirrels who watch another red squirrel open hickory nuts will learn to do that more quickly. Again, it's a phenomenon of savings in observational learning. And Israeli roof rats will quickly learn how to open pine cones, it's one of their favorite foods, to obtain the seeds inside if they have the opportunity to watch an older roof rat do the same thing first. Finally, chimpanzees who live in the rainforest in the African nation of Côte d'Ivoire, the former French colony of the Ivory Coast, employ a hammer and anvil system to crack the hard shells of the panda nut in order to obtain the very high-calorie kernel that's inside. Using archaeological methods, anthropologists have discovered that this behavior has been going on for more than 100 years at a particular site, which has a particularly good rock to serve as an anvil, to which the chimps bring both the nuts and rocks that they can use as hammers. It can take the chimpanzee as long as 7 years to learn how to crack a panda nut properly. But in the present context, the important thing is that individual animals do not appear to start the learning process from scratch. Rather, this behavior is passed down, chiefly from mother to child, by a process of imitation, or vicarious learning by example. Now, what's also interesting is that this kind of nut-cracking technique has been observed only in some bands of these West African chimpanzees. Other chimpanzee groups don't show it at all, suggesting that it's kind of a part of this group's ape culture that's been passed from generation to generation through observational learning. Observational learning occurs in humans, too, not just in rhesus monkeys and other non-human species. One of the earliest demonstrations of observational learning in nursery school children was by Albert Bandura and his colleagues in their famous Bobo doll experiments. A child and an adult were brought together into a playroom and seated in opposite corners. The child was given a number of items to play with, including ink stamps and stickers, which could be used to make various designs. The adult was given a set of tinker toys, a mallet, and a large inflatable Bobo doll. While the child was engaged in his or her activities, the adult became ever more aggressive toward the Bobo doll, punching it, kicking it, and hitting it with the mallet. In a control condition, the adult didn't interact with the Bobo doll at all. In another control condition, the children weren't exposed to any model at all. After 10 minutes, the child and the adult were separated, and the child was taken into a separate room where there was a variety of toys and games, including, you guessed it, a Bobo doll. The experimenter observed whether and to what extent the child behaved aggressively toward the Bobo doll, both imitating the adult's behavior and new creative ways of behaving aggressively. The result was that the children who observed the model behaving aggressively were more likely to behave aggressively themselves compared to those who observed the passive model. There were some interesting differences depending on whether the subject was a boy or a girl who observed a male or a female adult, but the general finding was that children who observed aggressive activity were more likely to be aggressive themselves. They acquired this behavior not through reward, but just through observational learning. A particularly good example is language acquisition, or the process by which a child learns his or her native language, or for that matter, any other secondary language. It turns out that language is learned simply by virtue of being exposed to a linguistic community, by virtue of being exposed to other people who are also speaking a language. And you learn whatever language you're exposed to. If a child of Chinese parents is raised by Russian foster parents, that child will learn Russian. And this is true even for deaf children, who will learn sign language easily, as long as they're exposed to sign language. This exposure has to take place within a particular period of time, roughly the period between birth and puberty. If a child's not exposed to language until after puberty, the child is never really going to learn language. It's going to learn only the rudiments of language at best, and that not very well and not very easily. But if a child is exposed to a linguistic environment from birth, that child will learn whatever language he or she is exposed to very, very easily. The critical period here is a little bit like the critical period for imprinting in ducks, except, of course, language is a much more complicated piece of behavior. But right from the beginning, infants who are exposed to adults who are speaking to them and around them will begin to pick up on the sounds of their language, to figure out which sounds belong to their language and which ones do not. They'll learn how to separate the sounds they hear into words that refer to various objects, events, and activities. They'll recognize some words as meaningful, others as not. They'll learn what these words refer to. And they'll also learn the grammatical rules by which members of a linguistic community string words together to make meaningful sentences. Not only that, but they'll learn the rules of prosody, of nonverbal communication, by which people also communicate and enhance their spoken communications. This doesn't happen by virtue of formal training, and it certainly isn't mediated by anything like reward and punishment. You learn the formal rules of grammar when you get to elementary school, but the fact of the matter is most of that knowledge you've acquired implicitly or tacitly, unconsciously if you will, by the time you're 5 or 6 years old. People learn their native language and other languages they've been exposed to by virtue of observation, by virtue of being exposed to people who are speaking and listening and doing, not by virtue of reward and punishment. Here's an example of observational learning, learning just by exposure without any reinforcement in infants, just 8 months old. Saffron and her colleagues played a recording of a continuous 2-minute stream of 4 3-syllable nonsense words like tupiro, golabu, bidaku, and padoti, presented over and over again in random order like this: tupiro, golabu, bidaku, padoti, golabu, tupiro, padoti, bidaku. In this way, the likelihood that the syllable tu would be followed by the syllable p was very high, because they're both part of the same nonsense word, tupiro. But the likelihood that the syllable tu would be followed by the syllable la was very low, because they're part of different words. Tu is part of tupiro, while la is part of golabu. After 2 minutes of this, the infants got pretty bored, and they started looking away from the loudspeaker. But when they were tested with a new sound stream consisting of 2 familiar words like tupiro and golabu, and 2 new words like dapiku and tilado that didn't resemble anything that they had heard before, when they heard the new words, the infants paid more attention to the loudspeaker, indicating that they recognized the difference. In a second experiment, the infants were exposed to the original sound stream as before, but this time the novel words were recombinations of the familiar words, like tibida and kupado, where the syllables of the new words crossed the boundaries of the old words. Tibida picks up the last syllable of padoti and the first 2 syllables of bidaku. Again, the infant's attention perked up when they heard the new words. Notice that there's no reinforcement here. Just by listening, the infants apparently picked up on the statistical structure of the speech stream, that certain syllables were highly likely to be followed by certain other syllables, but highly unlikely to be followed by certain other syllables. In other words, the infants learned to segment the speech stream, learning what the words were in the very strange language that was being spoken to them. Saffron and her colleagues suggest that infants learn natural language in just this same way, learning what constitutes words in their native language, what makes up a proper word, and then learning what these words refer to. But again, notice that there's no reinforcement. The children are picking up on the statistical structure of what they're hearing just by hearing it. Observational learning, in turn, is a special case of a broader form of human learning known as social learning, a term first introduced to psychology by Neil Miller and John Dollard in the 1940s. Whereas psychologists before them were interested in innate or biological drives like hunger or thirst, Miller and Dollard were interested in acquired or secondary drives, that is, some activities that could come to possess some of the properties of an internal drive state by virtue of learning. Imitation was one such drive. Imitation is a process by which similar actions are performed by two individuals in response to appropriate cues. Miller and Dollard argued that imitation is widespread because culture reinforces it strongly as a means of maintaining social conformity and discipline. It's almost a necessary component of the socialization process. Miller and Dollard further distinguished between two principal forms of imitation. In both forms, one person matches another person's behavior. In matched dependent behavior, however, only the model recognizes the cues that elicit the behavior. The person imitating the behavior doesn't know what cues are stimulating the behavior that's being imitated. A good example is crowd behavior, when people engage in actions like applauding or yelling simply because other people are doing so without necessarily knowing why. Copying, the other form of imitation, is a much more deliberate act, because here one person consciously conforms his or her behavior to that of another person. And this conscious conformity entails conscious awareness of the cues that elicit the behavior of the model. Miller and Dollard noted that imitation can be observed in even the youngest children, and indeed whenever one person possesses more authority or knowledge than another. Imitation is the chief means, they thought, by which patterns of behavior are passed from one individual to another. And you'll note that while, in their view, imitation begins with something that's reinforced, rewarded by the environment, eventually it takes on a life of its own, so that the person simply imitates without necessarily being rewarded. The notion of social learning occurring vicariously by virtue of imitation and other observational processes was expanded by Albert Bandura, a psychologist at Stanford University. Bandura's version of social learning theory is called a cognitive social learning theory because, whereas Miller and Dollard thought that humans were learning behaviors through social learning processes, Bandura understood that what they were really doing is acquiring knowledge in the form of expectations. Bandura argued that there were two principal forms of social learning. What he called learning by response consequences is a kind of trial and error acquisition of knowledge familiar from classical and instrumental conditioning. Here, the learner has the direct experience of trial and error, reward, punishment, or whatever, and develops the ability to predict and control its environment through these direct experiences. Bandura gives learning by response consequences a cognitive interpretation, in that direct experience doesn't provide, necessarily, reward or reinforcement or anything like that, but rather provides information concerning environmental outcomes and what the person has to do in order to gain or avoid them. As a result, the person forms mental representations of experience that permit anticipatory motivation and behavioral self-control. Imitation and modeling, by contrast, are examples of vicarious or observational learning, acquiring information by observing another person's actions and what their effects are. And Bandura goes on to distinguish two major categories of vicarious or observational learning: learning through example and learning through precept. Learning through example is modeling. It's imitation. It's where one person takes another person's behavior as a model for his or her own. And it's a very informal process. Learning through precept encompasses deliberate teaching and learning, often mediated by linguistic communication, such as what's going on in this course right now, where you're reading a book and I'm lecturing to you. The important point is that in both learning through example and learning through precept, we're learning from other people, not through the direct experience of trial and error and reward and punishment. And this learning is not mediated by reinforcement. It just occurs, much the way latent learning occurred for Tolman's rats. Social learning, in turn, forms the cognitive basis of culture, which anthropologists define as the customary beliefs, social forms, and material traits of a racial or ethnic or social group, which are transmitted through informal learning and formal training from one generation to the next. Learning is the acquisition of knowledge through experience. Social learning is observational learning, learning that's mediated vicariously, simply by watching and learning from other people. When one generation learns from a previous generation, when a child learns from a parent or a student learns from a teacher, that intergenerational transmission is cultural transmission, and it occurs by virtue of social learning. Informal learning by example. Formal training by precept. This intergenerational transmission of knowledge and beliefs and patterns of behavior can't be accomplished through the genes. As we've known since Lamarck, there is no inheritance of acquired characteristics. Instead, this cultural transmission has to be accomplished by learning, social learning via example and precept. It is through social learning, both modeling and in formal institutions such as schools and libraries organized for the purpose, that we pass down knowledge, beliefs, and attitudes from one generation to the next. In this way, each generation builds on the advances made by those who went before, and doesn't have to start from scratch, in the same way that each organism doesn't have to rely simply on evolution and can learn from its own experiences. Each individual organism doesn't have to start from scratch, doesn't have to reinvent the wheel every time. It can learn observationally, socially, by looking elsewhere to find out how to do the kinds of things and then build on them. Learning, then, is the basis of culture and of cultural transmission. But if all we did was learn what previous generations have learned before us, there wouldn't be any cultural change. If learning is the basis of culture, thinking is the basis of cultural evolution. And that leads us to our next big set of topics in psychology, cognitive psychology, our understanding of how our minds work as we perceive, remember, think, reason, and solve problems.